The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party will be supporting this motion because we want to have Meridian Energy scrutinised every year at select committees so that we can highlight the differences in outcome from the policies that the National Party is pursuing compared with those which would be secured for New Zealanders in a way which would reduce their annual household electricity bill by around $300 per annum. Now, Mr English, at the start of this, asked us to explain on this side of the House how it works. In order to get an understanding of that, you have to go back in history a bit and think about what's already happened. Meridian Energy is the largest hydro power producer in New Zealand. That hydropower is amongst the cheapest electricity to produce in the world. The cost of production of that electricity has not changed materially in the last couple of decades. It's gone up by inflation, won't have even gone up by the overall cost of inflation. The cost of producing electricity has not changed very much, but the price that is paid for that electricity, that hydro electricity to Meridian, has gone up year after year after year because of the pricing model that's used. As the cost of new electricity from alternative sources like gas, which doubled in price, and alternatives to gas like geothermal and wind went up under the current pricing model, the price paid for hydro has risen to the same level, essentially. So the price that is paid for hydro has risen far, far above the cost that it takes to produce it. Now, governments, this government and the prior Labor government and the prior National government beyond that, we went along with that while that extra profit that was being taken from that hydro was going back to public purposes. The profit of that extra profit that's being taken as a consequence of the price and overall electricity prices doesn't come from a change in the hydro station. It's actually come from the free public fuel that flows through those hydro stations. Now, we all went along with that when that was being recycled via the government's books into other things that the government spends money on for taxpayers, like HIP operations or educational services. But what the government did is they've now privatised that benefit through the sale of those assets to private shareholders. So instead of the public getting the benefit from the public rivers that are driving that electricity, it's actually private shareholders are getting it. And we say that's unfair. And we say, as a consequence, we shouldn't put up with this profiteering from our public rivers that drive the hydro stations that Meridian makes most of its money from. So how do you fix it? Well, there's two ways you could fix it. You could price water. You could charge them for the use of their water, and then you could recycle that money again through HIP operations and education services to the benefit of New Zealanders. That was one option that we could have pursued. The reason we didn't pursue that option was that would have been characterised by the government and by some of the industry participants as pushing up electricity prices, even though it wouldn't have. It would have been characterised in that way, and therefore we wouldn't have been able to achieve the benefit for New Zealanders that we want to, which is equivalent to $300 a year for an average consumer. The alternative is to say, well, you pay different sorts of electricity producers different amounts for their power, and in respect of hydro, which is so cheap to produce, you don't pay them the same amount as someone who's making making wind power or geothermal or gas-fired electricity, or indeed hydro from a newer hydro facility. Because you effectively take as a proxy for the price of water a reduction in the amount that they are paid for their hydro electricity. Now, is this practical? Well, First NZ Capital, I should say, in September last year, in advance of the Meridian Energy Limited, put out a document called Cash Flow Powerhouse, and they, in it, considered the prospects of Meridian, including what would happen if the Labor proposal was imposed. And they said this is how it could work. Step one, because Bill English obviously hasn't read this. I'm surprised that the Treasury hasn't brought it to his attention, given that it's a publicly available document. Step one, hydro generators are compelled by legislation to sign fixed-sum annual contracts in return for all of their future hydro revenue, i.e. they get paid their operating costs plus a fair return on their capital, the historic cost of those dams, not some artifice that's sort of later calculated, but what those dams cost them when they bought them. And they're paid a fair return on capital plus their operating costs, which is a far lower sum than they get currently under the current market model, which is privatising those extra amounts to others. So hydro generators are compelled by legislation to sign fixed-sum annual contracts in return for all their future hydro revenue. You've got to control when the water's released, and they suggest that this would be passed to the electricity system operator, currently part of Transpower, and we agree that's how it would work. So, step 2, NZ Power extracts swap option agreements from all the other major thermal plants to limit its exposure to the purchase cost, and then NZ Power interposes it into the settlement process, and the market continues to work. Indeed, the market would work better in our view, because you would be able to separate retail from the generators and you get more retail competition as well. So the financial impacts, step 4, according to this report from First NZ Capital, financial impacts on gentailers would now largely be in place, and this could take place. These steps could be completed within 1 to 2 years. So within 1 to 2 years, under a Labour government, you would have processes in place that strip out all that extra money that is being robbed of New Zealanders and given from the value of our public rivers, and given to the 1 or 2% of New Zealanders who have purchased shares in those electricity companies, and that money instead would flow through to lower electricity prices. The average consumer in New Zealand, residential consumer, would save $300 a year, around that amount, and commercial users and others would save around 5% of their bills. This is what would happen if you had a decent government stopping the privatisation effectively of our rivers, because that's what's happened. We're actually privatising, or the government is privatising, the value of those rivers to the shareholders of the private shareholders of the likes of Meridian, to the detriment of everyone else who, the 98% that don't get that private benefit from our rivers. This would reverse that. It would also increase competition in the market by separating retailers from generators, and we would have greater competition at retail. We'd have more transparency of people bringing on more generation. They would be less reliant on physical hedges if they were retailers, and if they were people who just wanted to generate, they could sell that into a proper market without having to be a giant gentailer themselves. So you get more small generators entering at the generation side, you get more competition at retail, and you would have more competitive pressure on prices. You would have better demand management, because those people could bid in instead of increases in capacity. You could have someone aggregating efficiency or taking the peak off demand, which is expensive to cater for, and that might be someone like Vector in Auckland aggregating photovoltaics in the future in a cost-effective manner. So you could take the peaks off demand, you'd have increased competition at retail, and you'd have increased competition for people wishing to supply new generation because they wouldn't need to be a gentailer either, and you'd find that some of the people who are willing to invest in that sort of thing would probably accept a lower rate of return than the generators who are involved in the current less competitive market. And as I've said, the super profits being taken off our rivers would be stripped out of the system and fed into the market in a way which would, the lower prices would be fed into the market in a way that would reduce prices. So rather than this being abolition of all markets, it's actually not. It's just changing the way in which they're structured. It would be fairer to New Zealanders, and New Zealanders who live in this country where we have amongst the lowest cost of production of electricity in the world, with 60% of our electricity being probably the lowest cost electricity in the world, like other hydro-rich areas. Those benefits would flow through to consumers. We've got plenty of disadvantages in New Zealand, being distant from large markets, with the risks of exports, of exchange rate fluctuations being faced earlier by our businesses than in countries with larger economies, and not facing those other economies not facing the transport costs that we have for long distances of exports. For goodness sake, at least our businesses have the advantage of our natural bounty, which is low-cost electricity, rather than concentrating that benefit in the hands of the 2% of people who purchase shares in the likes of Meridian Energy.
I call Tracy Martin.
Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.